Right. It's 3 o'clock on the 15th of July. Good afternoon. My name is James Callender. I am one of the MDs here at Fresh Minds. We're very excited to be continuing our webinar series, which has been running throughout the whole COVID crisis. For those of you that don't know, I'll just quickly tell you a little bit about Fresh Minds. So Fresh Minds is a resourcing and consulting business, finding super smart analytical people on a permanent basis. It's a permanent sort of levels of analysts right up to kind of experts. We do a lot of second businesses projects, so that's contract and project minds and contractors, and then finally manage projects where we actually run projects end to end, for our clients. And our clients tend to be drawn from the world of consulting, corporates, and private equity. But enough about that. Much more excitingly, I want to talk about our speaker this afternoon, which is Dan Salmons, who I would like to say is very much a great friend of Fresh Minds. In fact, I remember when I was probably about a year into my career at Fresh Minds, about 16 years ago, I was introduced by Caroline to Dan as a wise advisor to the company. And I think at the time he was at Capital One. But we've kept in touch over the years and watched him and his amazing career in that time. And he's worked at a range of places. I've just been chatting about his background, but started at Anderson, Barclay Partnership, had his own consulting business in the dot-com boom. He's worked for Barclays. More recently, he's been working for RBS, NatWest in their mortgage business. And I think just in the middle of COVID has taken over as CEO of Koji, which is a blockchain property business, which I'm sure he'll tell us a little bit about. But for me, I think Dan is the essence of an innovator. He is someone that not only talks a good game, but actually delivers on it as well. And I think I think ideas are quite easy to come by nowadays, but doing them and making them happen, I think, is a real challenge for all businesses. So in terms of the theme of today, out of crisis comes clarity. We've had this horrendous health crisis, an education crisis, and now obviously an economic crisis that we need to navigate out of. And for businesses like never before, the need to really focus on their strategy and innovating for a new future has never been so important. And so to help us kind of navigate this next few months, we thought it'd be good to bring in a range of speakers to talk to the subject of kind of growth and innovation. And Dan, we're very delighted to get you along this afternoon to talk about your viewpoints on clarity coming from crisis. So over to you. Before we begin, just remember the program. Dan's going to talk for about 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and then there'll be time for some questions. So if you have questions, please just type them into the chat thing to the panelists, or more broadly, and I'll chair a discussion at the end. So without further ado, over to you, a virtual clap to Dan.
Thank you, James, and thank you for the kind introduction. It's been a pleasure being associated with Fresh Minds over all these years. I hadn't realised it was quite so many. I must admit that makes me feel old, and makes me feel old as well. When we were talking about doing this, I said, yeah, I've been through 4 crises now in my time that maybe we'll reflect on as we're talking, but yeah, it has been a long time. But I thought I would start by a little bit of an innovation here. I'm a bit webinared out and a bit zoomed out. I don't know about you guys, but I thought we'd try and keep it a bit lighter and a bit simpler. And so there's not going to be any slides. It's just me chatting. I thought I would focus on some things, maybe a bit of exploration, hopefully a little bit of inspiration, and just share some perspectives on innovation. So if you want to kick back in your chair and relax a bit, you don't need to watch me on the screen, just relax, and we'll take this as a little oasis in what has been an incredibly busy period, hasn't it? I think for all of us. And we're at a really interesting boundary moment, aren't we? Boundaries are always interesting for innovation, and we're kind of halfway between, the shock and the challenge of the crisis and how we all had to react incredibly quickly to a really difficult moment for our businesses and for ourselves personally. And now we're entering this kind of new normal and whatever that might bring. And I always think that kind of boundary is always interesting, and boundary is always great for people, great for innovation. I mean, we go go to the beach, don't we, for a reason. The beach is the boundary between the land and the sea. So interesting stuff happens there. And if, like me, you occasionally like to troll up a mountain, that again, it's the boundary between the earth and the sky. And for me, most interesting things happen at boundaries. And, you know, perhaps it's no surprise I've ended up working in an area that is the boundary between financial services and technology. And, you know, as James touched on, over the last sort of 30 years, I've been involved in both large companies and also a bunch of smaller ones, with innovations involved in, you know, the early days of offset mortgages, even before that, WAP and IDTV for the older ones amongst you, the very early days of contactless and mobile payments, innovations in the Apple Watch, parking payments. I've done all sorts, and now involved in the digitizing the mortgage business, and then most recently the property business. So I like to think I've seen innovation from big companies and from small startups, and even running innovation consultancies. I've seen it kind of from most ways. And so hopefully some of the reflections we can bring out over the next sort of 40 minutes, you know, pull on some of the stories from that. I actually come from a bit of a line of innovators. My great uncle Harry was a great innovator in the pre-war days when jets first came in. The jet wash was melting the tar that linked the runway blocks together, and he was innovating at the boundary between chemistry and materials, and so created a new tar that didn't do that. And went on actually after the war to create something called Stayflex. And if any of you are wearing a collar and it's stiff without starch, you can thank my great uncle Harry for inventing Stayflex. Apparently he destroyed my great auntie Ginny's washing machine whilst developing it due to a slightly more explosive nature than he was planning. But he made such a small fortune out of doing that. That it actually funded my dad's first house when he got married. And Dad was also an innovator at the boundary of physics and biology. He was one of the founders of the field of bioengineering. So perhaps it was inevitable I would end up innovating at boundaries as well. But a good place to start is what do we mean by innovation? It's a question I get asked a lot. And people always want to know, you know, is it innovation if you just slightly incrementally improve a process, or does it have to disrupt an entire market? And my view is there's no cheese down that tunnel. It really doesn't matter. There is a continuous line of innovation between the most incremental improvement you can make and the most, you know, radical industry-changing thing you can do. The word innovate comes from Latin novari, to make new. And so as long as it's new to you, as far as I'm concerned, it's innovation. I don't mind if it's already done in another country, another industry, another company. If it feels new, if it's developing a new solution for you, and if it's got the difficulty of being new, which innovation always has for reasons we'll come on to, then as far as I'm concerned, it's innovation. If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it probably is a duck. The most important thing for innovation for me is that it has to be for a purpose. And you do see a lot of innovation that's just trying to innovate away from our current business. It just says, oh, we just need new stuff. And you see people running around with technological hammers looking for a nail they can hit with it. And for me, that's not really innovation, that's R&D. It's good to have some R&D, it's good to be exploring new ideas. But if that's all you're doing, then that's great if you're a university, but it's not very good if you're a company. The purpose of innovation should be to solve business problems that you have and that aren't amenable to an existing solution that you've already got. You know, if great uncle Harry could have just found a mortar that linked the runway together and didn't get burnt by jet fuel, then by jet wash, then there'll be no need to come up with a new substance. And I'm a great believer in that. Innovation is hard, it's difficult, it's expensive, it's risky. Don't do it if you don't have to. If there's an easy solution off the shelf, have it. But where innovation is useful is where you've got a new business problem that is not amenable to anything you know today, and maybe no one in the world knows the solution to it today, and then you've got to innovate. And the first reason I'm going to pick on as to why I think now is a great time to innovate is there are a lot of problems like that. A lot of what we're facing today is genuinely unprecedented, certainly in my lifetime and probably in a few generations. We're facing into you know, a whole load of very rapid and radical changes, and there probably aren't always existing solutions that immediately can be applied. And so that looks to me like a source of innovation. That's a moment when innovation is powerful, when you can bring new ideas to bear and get beneficial solutions. So this is reason number one, and I'm going to list a few for why I genuinely think now is a great time to be innovating. Of course, if you're going to solve a problem, the question is, what does a solution look like? How do you go about solving problems with innovation? And I'm going to introduce you to a slightly different way of thinking about solutions, which I hope is useful. And to do this, I'm going to take you back to your school days and to maths. Now, if you've studied O-levels in my day, or GCSEs or international exams, you will have done much the same kind of syllabus around maths. You get given a problem and then you get taught some kind of method to solve it, don't you? Whether it's fractions or equations or geometry. But no one tells you why they're doing that. It's the missing link for me in maths tuition. It's like, why are they teaching me all these methods? And there's actually a really interesting answer to that question. And I'm going to take an example. So they always say if you talk maths, you lose everyone. So I'm going to try and keep it super simple. And hopefully this is worth bearing with. So imagine you're given a really simple little equation with a couple of fractions. You need to add 5/6 plus 2/3. Okay, that's a problem. It's not particularly amenable to solving. If you're cleverer than me, you might be able to just look at it and know the answer. But most of us look at that and it's not amenable to an immediate solution. So what you do is you convert it into a different form. And that's what you do when you do the lowest common denominator thing. Now that different form we'll talk more about, that's called a solution space. It's a different form where it's easy to solve the problem. So you take your fraction, you convert them both into 6. You've now got 5/6 plus 4/6. Aha, that's a good solution space because it's really simple to add 4 and 5. That's 9/6, isn't it? So you convert it into the new form. Then you solve it, which is easy in your solution space. And then normally you have to convert it back again. You've got 9/6, convert it back to 1.5, and there's your solution. And nearly everything you were taught at school was giving you a solution space that's easy to solve the problem in. You convert it, solve it, and put it back. So what's the relevance for innovation? Well, the relevance of innovation is most great innovation, in my mind, is not about the problem. It's not about banging your head on the problem. It's about the solution space. It's about looking at it in a new way where it's tremendously simple to see what the solution is. And that's going to be really useful for the reason I'm going to come on to do with delivery. But let me give you a sort of more real example to do with business today. I actually talk about the business I'm involved in now, Cojute. Cojute's solving a typically complex problem. If you've ever bought or sold a house, your own house, it's a long and complex and opaque process. It can take 10 to 12 weeks at least, often longer. And I know it's complex because everybody I talk to about what I'm doing, the first thing they do is give me a story about how dreadful it was. And it's complex because estate agents and lawyers and banks and brokers and all sorts of people are involved. And they're all doing something different. And it's really hard to tell where you are in the process and what's going on. And you have to provide identity 10 times and all this kind of stuff. Now, there have been attempts to solve that before. It's been a problem for decades. But they tend to be slightly brute force attempts. Say, well, if only it didn't all work like that, if only everyone just used the same system and did it in the same way, wouldn't that be marvelous? But it's kind of like, well, yeah, but no one is. So that's not a solution. It's never worked. But what if you cast the problem differently? And that's what we've done at Cojute. The solution space here is to go, well, do you know that the problem is not one of how estate agents work or how conveyancing solicitors work or indeed how banks work. The problem is the connectivity. The problem is they cannot all see the same thing at the same time, and nor can the customer. They can't see an end-to-end view. They can't share documents with everybody. They can't easily pass messages around in real time. So once you see it as a problem of connectivity in the industry, then you're probably already ahead of me in what the solution is, and you won't be surprised to hear that what Cojute is doing is using the power of blockchain to connect the players in the property industry together. The solution is really, really obvious once you think of the problem differently. And then, of course, you have to convert that into the real world and then say, well, how are we going to roll that out? So the reason it's really important to have that clarity around the solution space with innovation is you need to be able to get that idea across to everybody else. You need people to share in the innovation and buy into it. And that's the real challenge of innovation. As James said at the beginning, you know, the idea is cheap, really. What's hard in innovation is actually affecting the change and seeing the market come to a different place as a result of what you've done. And there's a reason why that's difficult. And that's to do with the optimization of companies. If you think about it, good companies have grown up to do something and do it well. They've created individual divisions and processes, and those have then been refined, haven't they? They've got, you know, good processes that they've thought through. They've cut costs. They've put in systems. They've hired people to fit that structure. And generally, the more innovative something is, the more it cuts across that structure. And it doesn't just put another one in, if you like. It often thinks about the whole problem differently. And that's really difficult for highly optimized companies because, you know, that changes almost everything about the way they work. And one of the great challenges of innovation, and one of the reasons why the crisis makes a difference, is that optimization. Let me introduce you to another example of what I mean by that optimization. Take Coca-Cola. Back in the day, they used to have refrigerators in retail stores. They would give you a fridge, they'd fill it with the red Coke cans for you, and you would then sell the Coke. Now imagine the fridge is full of red cans and they sell really well. Now what if Coke wants to try a new innovative type of Coke in a green can? Perhaps it's mint Coke or eco Coke, I don't know. But it's a green can, it's a different one. Now the only way it's going to fit in that fridge is if they take some of the red ones out. Well, that's a problem because the red ones sell really well. Is the green one going to sell that well on day one of being introduced? Probably not. So that gives Coke a choice, doesn't it, as to what it does. It either sticks with the red cans and never innovates because it can't make room, or it removes some red cans and accepts it's a little bit de-optimized in order to try the green can and perhaps a blue one and a yellow one and be able to innovate. And making space for that de-optimization is really difficult for companies because they spend most of their time optimizing. So this is one of the reasons why a crisis is a really interesting time to innovate, because the innovation, the crisis itself has de-optimized the world. It's de-optimized every company. They no longer quite fit what the world needs. And that movement, that shaking around, has created a degree of fluidity. So it's actually an easier time to innovate now than it normally is. There's room for maneuver. There's acceptance that it's going to be different and we're going to have to change. And I was talking to the CEO of a company that deals with estate agents who was saying it'd been 5 years whilst they'd been trying to get everyone working at home, and it had all happened in about 3 weeks. And you may well have experienced the same kind of thing in your industry. So the second big reason why I think it's a great time to be innovating is there is actually movement. There's the opportunity to do it. There's the chance to innovate in a way like never before. I sometimes think of it as a bit like getting ketchup out of a bottle. You know, if you just hold it, doesn't move, does it? You've got to give it a shake, you know, and it's no use just sitting there waiting for your innovation to happen. You normally need to inject some energy in it, and ketchup's a superfluid, isn't it? It gets moving and it takes on a new form on your plate. And what the crisis does, it's given that shake, it's given that opportunity for things to get moving and to take on a new shape. So that's a second reason why I think it's a great time to be innovating. And then the third reason that it's a really good time to innovate is to do with competitive advantage. And for this, you're going to have to go to another one of my analogies. I hope I'm not exhausting everyone with them, but this one's a nice one. You can go on holiday for this one. So imagine you're standing in the water on some beautiful beach, perhaps in Barbados. You're in the turquoise sea with your feet in the white sand. I hope that's a nice image. And you're holding a drink. Now, if the waves are coming in gently, you can just resist them, can't you? You can just stand there, getting a little window on my holiday here. But if there's a big wave rolling in, and you try and resist it, you're just going to get blown over, aren't you? You're just going to get rolled over. You'd do better to be on a surfboard with a degree of movement and maybe paddle even to keep up as the wave comes in, and then you can go with it. And although it's a slightly tortuous analogy, I think that's really true of businesses as well. And those that sort of rigidly try and hold to what they're doing today find it going to really struggle in times of crisis. That return to the familiar is not the right response in many ways when everything is changing. Whereas those companies who can go with it can really take advantage of the change and can really get ahead. And there's a lovely quote by a British intellectual of the first half of the 20th century called Havelock Ellis, who used to say that the whole art of living was in a fine balance of holding on and letting go. And I think that's a great quote for times of crisis. There has to be a balance between what you try and shore up and maintain how it was and what you're willing to go with. And there's a long history of great companies who have come out of crises. You know, I've been through the 1987, early 90s, kind of the original, stock market crash, followed by the recession, the dot-com boom, and then crash of the 2000s, which took away my own firm at the time. In 2007/8, there was another crisis, wasn't there, with the credit crunch, and now another one. And although they're all different and equally terrible in their own way, in every one, great companies have come out. And if I look just back to 2008, businesses like Airbnb came out of that when, it was expensive and difficult to rent hotel space and people were looking for a cheaper way to do that, or Groupon, where retailers were looking for a way to do loyalty in a new way, and that took on. So there's always great companies come out of these moments. And I think those that can really gain an advantage. And this is a really third reason for taking advantage of a crisis to innovate. I think sometimes a little bit like training at altitude. You get someone like Mo Farah, and he's not training at sea level on a flat piece of ground, is he? He's going to be training up in the hills, where it's strenuous, it's difficult, the air's thin. But what it means is that as times get easier, as he goes over the mountain and comes back down to sea level, he's got a massive advantage on those who haven't. And I think companies are like that, actually. Companies don't necessarily benefit from growing up at a time when things are easy. It might feel easier, they might take off quicker, but they're more likely to struggle when times get hard. Whereas companies born out of difficult times have built themselves to have that kind of flexibility to deal with it, and therefore can come out very strongly. So that's three good reasons why now is a great time actually to innovate. It's, we need the ideas. There's lots of newness required to solve for the new situation we're in. The time is good for innovating, and there's a degree of fluidity, and because from a competitive advantage point of view, there's a real opportunity to get ahead. I'm going to turn to leading for innovation in just a moment. But before I did, I thought I'd just share a little example of what I mean when I think of an innovation agenda. I touched on it at the beginning, but I think this is one of the great secrets to innovation is not to be blunderbussing around with everything you could possibly go after, but deciding very key headlands you want to go after. And sometimes when I talk about this innovation agenda and leading for it, there's a bit of a danger that it's perceived as being very convergent, that at this point you've chosen your solution and you're being very precise. And I actually don't think that necessarily works well for innovation. What you need is a very precisely articulated problem, but a very broad way of solving it. And Charles Eames, one of my great design heroes, the designer of furniture and other things, he used to say that he'd never made a compromise in his life, but he'd always worked within constraints. And that recognition that great design comes from knowing your constraints. Here are the things that I've got to solve for. Within that, I can be very creative and flexible, but great design comes from knowing exactly the constraints. I think innovation's the same, that knowing exactly what the problem you're solving for is where great innovation comes from, providing within that you've got freedom. So I wanted to pull out a little example from years ago, the early days of contactless. I was involved way back at the beginning when it was still considered crazy stuff, and talk a little bit about what that agenda can look like. back in those early days, people forget the reason we wanted contactless cards in the first place wasn't particularly because we wanted the cards. The prize was we figured mobile phones, where smartphones had come out in 2006, it looked a lot like they could be the payment device of the future. But they don't fit in a terminal. You can't pay with a phone if it has to slot in and add your number. So we wanted a way of the phone paying that didn't involve sticking it in the slot. And contactless was a technology that had been around for a while and looked very appealing. And the joy of rolling out cards was it would get the retailers to put in the terminals, and then once the terminals were in, we could use the phone. But herein lied a problem. There were no phones back in 2007, 8 that could do anything contactless. So we had a very specific problem back in those days at Barclays, which was we want phones to be able to pay contactless. That's our business problem. We know if we can do that, we've got something really exciting for customers there. But how? And that's where then the divergent thinking came in. And in those days, I was working on a sleeve for the phone. I was working on, something that you could add a card in, a sticker on the back. We had a plug-in device at the bottom. We had even memory. Do you remember those tiny little SD memory cards? I had one made up to look like a tiny credit card, and you slotted it in, and I showed it to the executive team at the time, and one of them dropped it in her tea, at which point it became pretty clear that a tiny little credit card was probably not a good idea. But we also looked at, should it be on the SIM? Should it be in the phone itself? And that resulted in a four-way deal, or a revolutionary one at the time, between Orange and Samsung, MasterCard and Barclays, which created the UK's first mobile payment phone. But it's a nice example, because I think it shows that when the problem is well defined, you can actually be pretty creative within that, testing and playing with and trying different solutions until the right one emerged, which, as it happened, became clear that the phone itself needs to have contactless capability, and then you have Apple Pay and Android Pay and you're off. So when I talk about leadership, that's my first headland of, good leadership for innovation for me starts with defining that agenda. And so in this crisis, we've all come across a ton of new problems. Defining well, this is something I don't know how to solve for, is quite an art, actually. And you need a degree of openness and freedom to be able to do that and stare into the problem and define it as well as you can with as many constraints as you can. For me, that's the fuel of innovation. So your starting point is a really clear innovation agenda. The second thing you need is customer focus. It's a really curious thing, the relationship between the customer and innovation. When I first joined, I worked at a company called What If, which was a European innovation consultancy, which I led for a while. And one of the things I was curious about when I arrived there, they worked in lots of different industries, not just banking and finance. And I was curious, what did all the innovative companies they worked with have in common? And after a while, I realized there was only one thing in common. They kind of did innovation a bit differently, but they were all incredibly customer focused. They cared enormously how customers operated, what they liked, what they didn't like, what worked for them, what didn't work for them. And that is another great fuel for innovation solutions. So that relentless customer focus, I think now is more than ever a moment to get that back. All of those great research reports and all the rest of it from the last 6, 12, 18, 24 months, some of those will be out of date now. Customers have changed behavior enormously during this crisis. And I think this is a great moment to be re-engaging with customers and understanding how they work. And it will be irrational and illogical, because customers always do what customers do. They don't do what you expect to do. If I cast my mind back to those days innovating with mobile payments, one of the things we were working on was a sleeve for the iPhone 3 that would allow it to take a credit card. It was a sleeve because in those days we didn't realize they would keep changing the shape of the phone. And so a separate device, which is how MPOS works today, hadn't really occurred to us. We thought it would need to be a sleeve. And so I was asking the designers, can we make the sleeve as slim and light and elegant as possible, please? Because it's going to be on people's phone. It needs to take a credit card, but as light as possible, please. So they did that for me. And we were out there testing these new devices. We didn't even know what they were called in those days. And And I was watching customers and they were looking at them and going, I don't think it's secure. I don't know, I'd be happy putting a card in one of those. And we watched a few customers with this, and I looked at their hand. I said, what is it they're doing? Are they weighing it? And we thought maybe they were. So we went back to our poor long-suffering prototype makers and had them put a sliver of lead in it. This lovely light prototype they made. They put a nice chunk of lead in it. Felt nice and weighty. Following day, testing with customers. Do you think this mobile terminal is secure? Oh yes, yeah, that feels secure. Yeah, never mind the cryptography, the shielding, all the other things we'd done. That was what felt right. And it's an indication of really what, for me, customer insight is all about, is following what the customer's mind's doing. What heuristics are they doing? What do they expect? What do they expect to see? Really, really important fuel for innovation, and never more so than now, when the world is changing and you really can't guess what it is that they want. The third thing that I've touched on already that I think is really important for the leadership of innovation at the moment is letting go. I touched on that quote by Havelock Ellis, that sense of not sticking to the way we've always done things, but actually being ready to let go. I think that's a really easy thing to say and a really hard thing to do, not least at a time when many of us are going to have to also, manage the existing business, solve for the existing problems. Of course, I get all of that, but some of it has to be, and I think this is the challenge for leaders in times like these, is to have that openness to the new ideas, be willing and able to adopt new solutions rapidly, even if that wasn't on the plan at all last year, even if it doesn't fit quite what we were expecting to do. Well, we're just going to have to do it. The fourth thing is energy and momentum, and I talked about this a bit with the ketchup bottle, but that's a massive job for leaders with innovation. I've sometimes seen companies that are struggling with innovation, and when you look at they asked me to have a look, and you realize what they're doing is it's like they've got a damp forest and they've put lots of candles burning around it, hoping it'll dry it out. And of course, the individual little innovation candles are just flaming out individually. And the answer with innovation, you need to bring all the candles together in one point, get some real fire going, dry out the forest, and then it'll spread. And that sort of oomph and momentum is really important at times like these, so that your beautifully clear solution space, the innovation you want to bring, has to be married with a good degree of momentum. You can't tickle these things into action. Very often you need to put more into it to get it to fly. And that's not easy. It's the 99% perspiration of innovation. Some people are amazing at it. Steve Jobs, people used to refer to him as having a reality distortion field, as if people around him just believed what he said. Most of us aren't that lucky. But I think doing things with significance that really moves the dial, that boldness, that bravery to take it, make it happen, I think is critical now. This isn't a time for half measures or faint moves. I think once you've got the idea and it's shaped and it's worked and it's tested, now you've really got to make it move and put that effort behind it to get it to go. And then finally, people. The fifth element of leadership that I think is so important at the moment is to really look again at the people that you've surrounded yourself with to do what you're doing in the next 18 months. It's a harsh reality that the kind of people that are really good at running and optimizing the sort of existing setup of a company are not often the same ones who are really good at shaking that all up, thinking of a different way, cutting across. Now, you need a mix. You obviously don't want to swap everyone, but I do think this is a moment when you should be looking around your business, finding the people that are good at that see the world that way, that are comfortable with the ambiguity and able to adopt and bring in those new solutions. And every company has them. This is the moment to bring to the fore. I wrote a few weeks ago about how I was seeing innovation teams sometimes, almost the crisis hit and everyone said, oh, let's forget the innovation team, those crazy guys with the strip wood floors, I don't know what they're doing, AI or something, they're irrelevant. We've got a crisis on our hands. And really the opposite should be the case. We should be going, innovation guys, get over here, leave that whatever it was you're doing. We've got big, difficult problems that need novel solutions. We need to get you to work on them. So I think this is a real moment to think about bringing to the fore those people who are naturally more more creative, more flexible, and able to drive these novel solutions through, and making sure that they've got a voice in amongst the leadership team and with you. So a whole range of different thoughts and ideas, and some analogies and stories in amongst there, which I hope proves useful. My own view is this is an amazing moment in time. It has been grim and tough for many people, there's no doubt about it, and will continue to do so. But as people who have the privilege of leading businesses at this moment, I think it's a really amazing moment of change. You know, we've had some of these digital solutions and technologies around for 10 years, evolving, but the adoption hasn't yet taken off with some of them. And I think what we're seeing is almost a second digital age emerging, as some of these technologies now suddenly, they suddenly are the solution to so many of the things that we want to do. And I think we'll see a real acceleration in innovation. And so I hope in 20 years' time, some of us on this call can look back and go, you know what, some pretty amazing companies emerged from that period. And, I was part of I hope we can all say, I was part of bringing forward new solutions at a time when, obviously the world really needs them and driving things forward. So certainly I think a super interesting time to be innovating, not without its challenges, but a great time to be an innovator, I think. And I hope I've given you a little bit of hope and inspiration to do more. Back to you, James.
Great, thank you so much. Absolutely, lots of food for thought there. So yeah, feel free to type in a question into the chat thing at the bottom here, and so I can sort of see your Q&A or your chat. Send it through. I've a couple of questions for you to sort of kick things off. I mean, I suppose right now because of the kind of crisis, the need to innovate is super key, and therefore it's accelerated the success of companies like Zoom, and many other digital businesses that were probably struggling for adoption have done really well and forced a lot of us to do things that we thought we'd probably do at some point in the next 5 years. We've done it within the next 5 days. But in terms of your discipline, like pre-COVID, like what is the right amount of time to spend innovating per se? Because I think, as you say, it is easy just to kind of get a bit stuck in the day-to-day, the trading reality of the quarterly update. How do you culturally, and that's not for everyone I know, but for leadership, I suppose, well, how much sort of apportionment of time would you recommend putting into the innovation?
It's a really good question. I think the answer is in the question. I think it's marvelous to apportion time for it. I think in a way it'll vary from company to company and from industry to industry. But I think the idea of carving off time, and not just time, but people and budget for it is really important. The rules of innovation often don't follow the normal way that a company would judge whether money was well spent. The Coke can analogy is a good way of thinking of that. If you use the normal rules for judging whether we should spend time on something, you probably wouldn't innovate at all. So I think that sense of, carving off time to do it, setting aside an amount of time and people and budget, I think that's super important. But it's also really important that they're focused on business priorities. I'm not a fan of the sort of, the lab in the corner that no one really knows what they're doing. You'd much rather the company has some known challenges it's got to solve for, and they've set aside, time and money for those folks to do it. It's very interesting when you look across different industries. I was looking at my own property industry the other day, that sits at the bottom of the rankings for how much it invests in innovation and technology, and it shows, the experience that we have of moving house is because of that. And there are other industries, higher up, but there's no doubt the ones at the bottom are going to have to come up. They just are. There's demand there to be investing more and to be demonstrating they can be more innovative.
Yeah. And then how do you, when you're if you're in charge of that business, I suppose one of the challenges is to not, I think research and testing is important to, look at what a future might look like. And clearly a number of those ideas won't work. But I've also seen before, even in Fresh Minds and other companies, whereby people spend a lot of time, probably too much time gets spent on this great innovation, which people kind of realize maybe a few months in might not be this great hope they once had, and it keeps being done because it's good to innovate rather than it's the right business sort of move. At what point are you in the sort of fail fast sort of category when it comes to sacred cow projects that continue to run on and on?
Yeah, definitely. And the trick is, in a way, by the time it feels like failure, you've probably already gone past the point you shouldn't. Yeah, people tend to say yes too much at the beginning and no too much at the end. And you want lots of no's at the beginning and lots of yeses at the end. So yeah, I think that mentality that you keep it cheap and light and quickly discard ideas, and then I latch onto the ones that work and back them properly. I think that's right. Yeah, people always say, oh yeah, we're happy with failure around here. So I am not happy with failure. I hate failure. It's really annoying, and it does happen, and you have to accept that that's part and parcel of the innovation life. Some things fly and some don't. But I do think, yeah, that willingness to try stuff quick and dirty. The agile has been a marvelous development, I think, for the whole culture of business around innovation. The old days we used to build, you might remember, James, we used to build waterfall plans. We used to literally sit at the beginning of a project and try and plan out everything that was going to happen for the next 3 years. And that's not a good idea for anything, but it's especially bad for innovation when there are so many unknowns. So the more you can break it into those little segments that we tend to in the agile world, the better off you are, actually, because you can trial it. And my own company, Koju, we've been piloting stuff for about 18 months with increasing numbers of real businesses and customers playing with it, trying it. And we've found lots of routes that you can't digitize the property market on the way. And that's been awesome, being able to do that. And it gives us tremendous confidence now that after that period, we've got the thing that works. We're ready to go with it. But yeah, I don't think there's no shortcut for that, actually. No amount of planning or guesswork will do it. You have to try it, but you've got to be able to try it, yeah, quickly and cheaply.
Super. So, and that probably links to our first question. I have a few questions coming through. Thank you so much. First one from Kirsty. Thank you for the advice and insights. How does one prove one's creativeness to leadership? My experience has been that sometimes it's difficult to demonstrate innovation when managers are not willing to hear or give your ideas a chance.
Yeah, that's I'm very sympathetic with that. I think one of the hallmarks of companies that struggle with innovation is their inability to get ideas and creative stuff out of the bottom. The great innovative companies. I spent some time with Four Seasons Hotel, who are one of the most innovative hotel chains in the world, and they have this marvelous capability that if anyone has an idea at almost any time, within 24 hours it's been sucked in to be considered and processed. And I think that that's fantastic. It gives them tremendous sort of impetus for innovation. I think it's difficult without those structures. I definitely recognize that, and obviously encouraging companies to have structures that allow that to crop up. I do think, though, that the one to watch for is that ideas themselves, as I said earlier, are quite cheap, actually. And sometimes people are frustrated because what they're presenting is ideas, and actually action is, which may be even harder to achieve in the wrong environment, but it's action that speaks volumes, actually. And it's very easy to dismiss an idea. It's quite hard to dismiss something that people like and are using. And I've seen many great innovations sort of creep up on management because people are just doing them. They've discovered it works and they're off. And once it's working with customers and proven, then it can latch on. So I think not expecting management to process raw idea into big initiative is probably right. But what you always should be looking to do is, how do we get some traction on this, some demonstration that in the real world this has value, and then it's much easier, I think, to sell it into a corporate system. But yeah, companies vary enormously at how able they are to adopt that. I agree.
Yeah. So our next question is from Luke, who I think is also an old friend of Fresh Minds. Hello, Luke. Dan, thanks very much for the fascinating thoughts. As an investor, I see many early stage companies which aspire to be innovative, but of course, many will ultimately fail. How do you judge what innovation is likely to work? Or to put it another way, are there signs or common traits, people or processes or approaches that shows innovative efforts that are kind of on the right track? or is it the nature of things that success cannot be foreseen?
Oh, that's such a good question, isn't it? I guess the glib answer is, of course, if I was really good at that, I wouldn't be here, would I? I'd be sitting, I'd be a VC somewhere sitting in Barbados, I suspect. It is really difficult at that early stage. There's no doubt about it that the earlier stage you're judging an idea, the less substance you've got to go on in terms of proof. What do I look for? I mean, some of the jobs I've had, I get approached all the time, particularly the corporate innovation jobs. You get a lot of approaches from early stage companies. I'm certainly always looking for that solution space. Have they got a fresh insight here? It's not just a technology, but have they seen something a different way to the way the rest of the world looks at it? For me, that's always a good sign that someone's onto something, that they make me look at it and go, oh, I haven't thought of it like that. I can see why that might work. The customer piece is really key. I absolutely love it when there's some demonstration, some insight, some belief that customers will take it. And then the delivery route. Cannot tell you how many ideas I get presented with that in theory would be great, but the problem is the adoption. There's no solution to the adoption problem. And often, particularly when I've been working at banks, they're approaching the bank because they think the bank's the solution. If only you gave this to all your customers, my problems would be over. And the answer often is, no, your problems are your problems, and they need to be solved for me to be willing to give it to my customers. The other thing to say, though, and I'm very aware of this, particularly with my advancing years in innovation, is there's a great danger that familiarity breeds contempt, that you're so familiar with a subject that you're actually not very good at judging whether this is good or not, because we all do it. We've all got our cognitive biases, and I may well sit there and go, oh no, I've seen that 5 times. Everyone's tried that. It won't work. And of course, that's not a good mindset for innovation, actually, because maybe this is the one that would. So I'm very aware that that's a bias you've got to be really careful about. You're not too quick to leap into the rails your own mind runs on. And I have in the past referred people to someone else because I've literally said, I'm sorry, I think I know too much about that subject. I'm not going to be very insightful on it for you. I've done that for years. It's like, go and find someone who's new to it and will think differently. But yeah, I think it's very challenging in that early stage, but it goes back to the same rules. And, VCs operate like this very nicely, that that we work in stages. You put in a little bit of money at the beginning and you see whether it gets the traction that you hope. And the real world is the best way to find out, isn't it?
Yeah, I'd say as a headhunter, obviously meet lots of people who run innovation teams. I think that people are those, they need to be dreamers, but they also need to be quite realistic as well. So they're quite good at sort of explaining what the market might look like in sort of 3 to 5 years' time. And that feels more believable and investable than something that's 20 years down the line, when so many other kind of variables would have changed the market or the customer behavior in that period.
No, I think that's really true. And also, I mean, the people side, the track records, I think is really interesting, isn't it? I don't think people don't suddenly, deliver an innovation at some point. They've normally demonstrated, like the question earlier, there's someone who right from the start, is trying to innovate all the time. It doesn't suddenly emerge. So I think I'm often looking for that. Is this someone who's tried stuff before? I quite like people who failed stuff before, actually. I'm always a bit suspicious of people who haven't had a good old failure. Because I think you learn nothing from success, do you? Because you think you did it. Whereas you learn a ton from failure because you realise you didn't.
Yes. And one observation here is around the customers. And I don't know, was it Henry Ford who said, if I asked my customers what they wanted, they'd say they wanted faster horses. What's your general view on research and business insight from the customers themselves, in terms of, does the answer lie in do they know what the future market might look like, or is it really for you as the designer of the product and the designer of the business to tell them what the future might be?
Yeah, it is. I totally agree with that. It's absolutely no use asking customers what they think the future looks like. They in the nicest way, genuinely don't know. So that's not, for me, that's not the purpose of customer research. Actually, the purpose of customer research is to gain insight into how they're thinking and what they're doing. And I love penny drop moments like the example I gave earlier, where you suddenly go, what are they doing? Why have they said that? That seems really odd. I remember a project we were doing the very early days, pre-Netflix. We were working on a streaming video service, and we were talking to customers, and we came across this really curious thing where they said, sometimes I end up watching on TV a film I've got on DVD, and it's been sitting on the shelves for weeks. And I bet we've all done that, haven't we? And we just sat there and going, why? That's a really curious thing to do. And out of that came a whole insight into how customers separate, setting aside an evening to sit down and view a film from just watching what's on telly that satisfies me because I'm bored now. And the same film may be fine for one and not for the other. But I think that's what customer research is for, deeply understanding the emotional motivations of customers, why they're doing what they're doing, what they like, and then that guides the innovation and the future direction. And sometimes it pops out. Sometimes it's really obvious. I mean, it's some of the work we've done around the property market. It's not difficult to see why customers are frustrated with what they're doing and what their motivation is. Sometimes it sings out really clearly, but then when you come to the answer, what's going to work for them, then you need to be really thoughtful that you're following their path. So yeah, I think the answer, don't ask them what they want, but definitely find out why they want it.
They want it, yeah. Great. Next question from Matt. Thank you for a great talk. I agree with you that innovative people are comfortable with ambiguity. I wonder, what approaches, methods do you use to get rid of the barriers that make some businesses feel uncomfortable with ambiguity and get them to the point where they are excited about embracing uncertainty? So it's kind of how you set the culture and processes for innovation within a larger or a smaller business.
Yeah, these are really thoughtful questions. So firstly, I think there should be process and structure. A lot of what companies are doing when they resist traditional attempts at innovation are trying to manage risk. And that's to be applauded. Companies should manage risk. And what you often are trying to do with the change of culture is not shift the amount of risk they're taking, but change how they manage it and how they perceive it. So instead of trying to nail everything down to minimize the risk, which looks good, but the reality is, of course, you're opening yourself up to enormous strategic risk that the world changes and you haven't. What you need to do is have that slightly broader view of risk, where you're also managing the risk that you don't have innovations in certain spaces or don't have solutions for certain business problems. And then you want to see in your process that you are managing risk for the process itself. So yes, that you are turning down failures early and you are not running long projects that waste a lot of money without output and all those things that, good businesses rightly hate. So it's a, in a way, the whole of strategy, really, if you think the whole of thinking about the future and working out what's going to happen and making choices, it's really a risk mitigation strategy. And I think if you couch it as, if you like, the risk mitigation, the risks you face as a business over the next 5 years are the risk that you won't achieve your aims are either that the world changes now, or that the world changes by the time you get there, or that the method you're using to get from A to B doesn't work. And each of those is a risk you can solve for. And one of the ways that you solve for not the world not being, suitable for where you're going is to have bets in places. Some of the companies I've worked at who struggled with the financial side of it, I've used the language of options with. So you're buying cheap options that could be valuable. And in one case, I remember what we agreed was that the innovations I would guarantee they'd wash their face. So we wouldn't lose money, but there was no guaranteed upside. There was the opportunity of upside, but who knows what that was. But what we'd guarantee is that the team washed its face, with a combination of sales and brand uplift. And that was quite a nice basis because the finance people could get comfortable that, okay, well, they'll definitely do that. I don't believe they're going to have any hits, but I don't need to worry about that because at least there's no guaranteed misses. So it's probably not a sort of single answer, but I think recognizing that those objections are often well-founded in risk, but in old risk mitigation strategies, and making sure that what's being put forward is a new way of managing the risks and of solving for them using innovation to do that I think that's how I've tended to approach it.
Yeah, very useful. And we spoke a bit earlier around the dot-com boom. Remember that of what was it, 97, 2001. And in some ways, we're having a bit of a venture capital boom in North America and Europe at the moment as well. It seems a huge amount of innovation is being subsidized by venture capital money from the west coast of the US, from delivery companies to taxi companies. I'm sure you think that's a good thing, but does it not have to become at some point a bit of a reckoning when things have to kind of make a profit or show some kind of return to shareholders and not just be a massive grab for customers?
Yeah, it does at the micro level, but the macro is inherently inefficient in capitalism. I remember years ago, and this really dates me, it must have been in the 90s, when the Iron Curtain was just coming down, and we had the mayor of Moscow visit the consulting office I was at. And he was very interested in how the West used computers to be more efficient. And one of his questions was, so how do you make sure enough tractors are in production in the UK? Do you have a central database? Is that the technology? And it's like, no, we let individual companies produce the number of tractors they think, and if they've got it wrong, they won't sell, and it sort of sorts itself out. And his response, he was quite shocked. He thought that was fantastically inefficient. And of course, on one level it is, and on the other level, we know it works out better than central planning. I kind of see something a little bit similar with investment in technology, that it is possible that, all the VCs and all the money rushes after something in a bit of a gold rush, hoping it'll work. And you're right, on balance, some of it doesn't, and it shakes itself out, and some people win and some lose out of that. But the process, if you like, is more efficient than trying to more formally allocate. You also, one of the things that's interesting now, do you remember the old Gartner hype curve? I guess we all know that. I think these days you get multiple hype curves as people get really excited about technologies and then sometimes disappointed. I first worked on AI in the early 90s at a time when you could train a piece of software to learn something, but it ran so slowly that the only way to run it was you then had to convert it into hardware. You made a circuit board or a chip that reflected the neural network, and then you could run it. Obviously, you couldn't change it again then. And no surprises, guess what? That early flourishing of AI and neural nets then collapsed because it was no use for much. And I think we've seen the same. I've talked quite a lot about the blockchain hype curve, where tremendous excitement and a belief it would solve for everything. And then you come down the other side, and then gradually it becomes clear what exactly it is good for. And you start to see real applications in trade and banking and exchanges and all of healthcare. And now, of course, it comes back up as people are now expecting something new. So yeah, I think you do get these inefficiencies as people work out what stuff works. But yeah, I don't know a better way of doing it.
Yeah.
And yeah, in a way, it doesn't bother me. It seems to me it's people trying to find where the money should be.
Yes. Yeah. Now we've nearly had our full hour, so I've got a couple of questions here, and then we'll pass on. But yeah, first, an easy one, Lucas. Yes, this will be made. This will be recorded and will be available on LinkedIn and through Fresh Mind. So if you want to watch it again at your leisure, be very welcome. And then final question from Alex. What advice do you give for those seeking to innovate when there is less budget and less capacity seemingly available?
Yeah. So I in a way that sounds hard. I definitely get that. We've all had been through an experience at some point of our budgets being cut. I think treat it like Charles Eames does, as an interesting constraint. It is astonishing sometimes quite how useful a massive slash of budget is, because it can stop you going after that big project with that clever consultancy and all. Sometimes these things take on a life of their own when actually you could have tested it really quickly and cheaply. I love stories of people testing stuff. The James Averdick, the founder of Goo Puddings, famously first tested that by literally walking into Tesco and putting some of his mock-ups on the shelf and then standing back and seeing if anyone took it. No deal with Tesco, no customer research, thoroughly illegal, but brilliant. And I love stories like that where people just find a neat way to find a way through. So yeah, it feels painful to cut a budget, but you know, the entrepreneurs out there will know very often you do have to find a way to demonstrate something works for practically nothing. So yeah, treat it like a marvelous constraint. Easy to say, hard to do.
Yes, yes. Well, it's probably good to finish on a delicious chocolate pudding. I'll thank Dan in a moment, but just quickly, our next webinar is with Derry Hughes, who is great. He's a kind of advisor to the consulting industry. So if you run a consulting firm, be it big or small, he's got some thinking on where the consulting industry is moving in terms of flatter management styles, more inclusive, more inventive consulting firms, and critically more profitable ones. So that's 2 weeks time on the 28th of July. So looking forward to that. And just a couple of thank yous. Number one, thank you to all you out there for tuning in on a slightly unimpressive July afternoon. It's lovely to see you all. But a very, very big thank you to Dan, very busy guy with a big agenda. So thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts from your grandfather, your father, and you. Line continues, and we certainly did him proud, both of them very proud today. So thank you so much.
Thank you, James. Pleasure as always. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you.